Hear These Words, a podcast from Good Shepherd Episcopal Church in Tequesta, Florida. I'm David Dixon, the Youth and Family Minister.
I'm Derek Larson, Associate Rector.
And we are joined today by Sherry Folatar, a parishioner at Good Shepherd and active in a number of our groups and committees. Say hi, Sherry.
Well, hi there.
Each week on the podcast, we discuss the passages of Scripture assigned for the upcoming Sunday. This week is the 23rd Sunday after the Pentecost, November 13th, 2022, and the words we hear are from Malachi chapter 4, verses 1 through 2, Psalm 98, 2 Thessalonians chapter 3, verses 6 through 13, and Luke chapter 21, verses 5 through 19. Well, hello, Sherry. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be here.
Awesome. So tell us some of the stuff that you do around here at Good Shepherd when you're in town. You are what we call a snowbird, right?
That is true. Joe and I come from Maine, and we spend probably 7 months here in Florida.
Right.
And we are Florida residents. But we joined Good Shepherd in 2010 when we moved here. And we have been fairly active and committed ever since, after dabbling, getting the lay of the land of churches around. We really found the welcome here to be remarkable.
Right.
Which is no great surprise to those of us
Right.
who are here. But what I have probably benefited the most from, and maybe contributed a bit to, would be anything that is small groups.
Mm-hmm.
I really, with that kind of a background in social work and such, I'm comfortable in that kind of a setting, and I find the interaction so authentic and sincere and forthcoming among our parishioners, and often we have guests from the community who are interested in, depending on our topic. So we have various groups going on here all the time: Bible groups, social groups, whatever, healing groups, grief groups. And I've participated in most of those. And we have some really good ideas of some things yet to come.
Nice. Yeah. Sherry's been such an important part of a lot of the small groups, like you said. I am really grateful for the insight you bring to so many of our groups. So our theological book study, or a discernment group that you were recently on, a number of other groups. You just have a real way of finding depth in our conversation. So if we get kind of stuck up in the shallow, we know that Sherry is going to ask us a question to help us get down a little deeper, and think about how something affects the deep part of our lives, our own heart. So I really appreciate your presence here and all you bring to these small groups that you're part of.
Thank you. It's a privilege.
Now, those groups, are you participating via Zoom while you're in Maine, I believe?
Yes.
Yeah?
As a matter of fact, we have some groups going in Maine.
Awesome.
And so we did it in reverse when we were in Maine with the groups here, and vice versa. In Maine, we have a Benedictine group every week, which is a remarkable group. It's very, very special and deep, as you suggest, and a lot of good sharing. We don't have that particular group here, but we have some other things, and as I said, some good ideas.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
Awesome. What's your favorite ice cream?
Oh, toffee nut.
Oh, nice.
I didn't know that was part of this agenda.
I sprung it on you.
I sprung it on you.
You did.
Well, our texts are really rather interesting for this week, and of course we're moving towards the end of the church year, coming to Christ the King Sunday, and then we enter into a new church year with Advent 1. And the texts tend to be a bit more eschatological in nature, and so we have Malachi here. What do you guys think about this text?
How about a definition of eschatological?
Eschatological. So it would deal with, some people say, last day or end time things, but it really has to do with the understanding of God's kingdom that is now and yet to come. So it's the reign and the rule of God in the life of humanity.
Thanks.
And understanding that.
But in general, the end is coming.
The end is coming.
And we can say that about the passages this week. A lot of the passages, particularly Malachi and our gospel reading from Luke, are they talk about catastrophic things that feel like the end. And of course, humanity has had a number of those experiences. Mm-hmm. And even today, we can talk a lot about catastrophic things going on in the world. And so in the scriptures, when we see these end time texts or mm-hmm. catastrophic texts, we tend to talk about them as eschatology and mm-hmm. how God is present and coming in the midst of those things. Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah.
So we have Malachi. I think right off the bat, where the text opens with see. Of course, the word see here is behold in other translations. And the term behold is not to, it implies to not look at it on the surface, but to have a three-dimensional type or even a fourth-dimensional type of view of the thing that is about to be discussed. To understand fully what is being discussed or that is going to be brought up. And so you have in Malachi this kind of address. He's really upset with the state of the priesthood, right? And there are some accusations that are made. And in all of this kind of turmoil and concerns and issues that Malachi is addressing, we get to the last portion of the text that we have before us, and there's this ring of hope or promise, mm-hmm. right? The Son of Righteousness shall rise with healing in its wing. It's wrapped up and hidden away in all of the mess right. that you have to kind of drag yourself through to get to. And sometimes that's tough. Sometimes it's hard to see hope in the midst of chaos and disorder and confusion and problems. But and that is really the time when you need to hear a message of hope in the midst of that stuff more than ever before, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, in Malachi, they did talk about, or he talked about, healing being only promised to the righteous. Mm-hmm. And I think it's the arrogant and the evildoers will be destroyed, mm-hmm. which is something of a negative. Mm-hmm. And it's like a line in the sand. And my question that came to my mind and probably my heart was, even though this is Old Testament, it does not sound like the message Jesus is going to come with forgiveness and reconciliation mm-hmm. and healing. So I found that word, the part where the sun's going to rise and there will be healing, a bit of a disconnect from all of the arrogant and the evildoers will be destroyed. But healing is somehow going to come.
Right.
It was a little
jarring, right?
Yeah, I didn't compute it too well.
The image of fire is really present in Malachi and in a lot of the prophets and in the teachings of Jesus. But here we have fire as in burning like an oven. We have the day that shall burn them up, and then even the image of the Son of Righteousness. Mm-hmm. I mean, we think of sun as a source of fire as well. If we look back into the chapter before, though, Malachi 3, you see the image for fire there is a refiner's fire. Right. It's a fire that's meant to purify, mm-hmm. To bring, to bring to completion. To get rid of all of the harmful, mm-hmm. dirty things, and to bring wholeness. And so there's a lot of different ways to talk about fire, and there's no way around it. This is a passage of judgment and of pain and of frustration. But I do think it's helpful to think about fire in those terms, that sometimes the difficult things, the judgment things, the things that we need to take responsibility for that hurt, can bring about healing and wholeness if we go through them. So I don't want to say that we want to focus on the good news here in this passage and the hope, but this is a passage of judgment, and sometimes we've got to go through that judgment. And just one other thing that I wanted to mention about this passage, the context is key. We're getting less than 2 verses on Sunday. That's all we're going to hear. But Malachi is only 4 short chapters. And so if you have time before service on Sunday, read through Malachi. It's the last book in the Hebrew canon. This is the last chapter before we move into Matthew. Now, that's a little superficial because they're not actually connected. They're 2 different books that happen to be next to each other. But still, there's a symbolism there. These are the last words of God in the Hebrew canon before we move into the message of Jesus. But when it talks about evildoers, when it talks about the arrogant and all of that, who is it talking about? If we go back to chapter 3, it shares a little bit more of that, where through the prophet Malachi, God speaks and says, "Then I will draw near to you for judgment. I will be swift to bear witness against the sorcerers, against the adulterers, against those who swear falsely, against those who oppress the hired workers in their wages, the widow, the orphan, against those who thrust aside the alien or the immigrant, and do not fear me, says the Lord of hosts." So it's also helpful to think about what are the kinds of things that are being judged, and so many of them have to do with care for the oppressed or the marginalized, the poor, those that are particularly vulnerable. And that's what the Israelites in Israel were not doing, or the majority of them were not doing when Malachi was speaking.
Again, context is everything, isn't it?
Right, it is. Yeah. And it is an issue of behavior. Do we really think that by destroying people, God is destroying evil? No. But by destroying behaviors, dealing with behaviors, you don't have to destroy people to deal and correct behavior, right? And that's what's being addressed here, is the behaviors, relationships, communities. And in fact, Malachi closes out in this chapter, the verses we don't have, with a promise. "In that day, I will turn the hearts of the fathers toward the children, and the hearts of the children will be turned back towards the father." So there is a healing that is taking place, but what has to be rooted out, and he addresses it here, he says, "I will root and branch." I will deal with the causes of this type of behavior. And that is, of course, part of what the gospel and the new covenant is, something that is written within the hearts of people that changes who we actually are from the inside out. So it is interesting. Context is key here. And it is probably different for us today as we read it than it was for people in that day as well. So.
And behaviors flow from the heart.
Yes.
So it's the heart we're going to work on.
That's right. Absolutely. All right, moving into our Psalm 98. And this is a great psalm. It's actually, we know psalms are typically sung, right? I think it would be great, Father Derek, if we actually could do simple chant with this song on Sunday. I think it would be a perfect one for us to, instead of just reading, if the congregation could sing it together. And it starts out, "Sing to the Lord a new song." And the very first thing I thought of when I read that phrase is, how do you sing a new song? And the thought occurred, well, you have to stop singing the old song before you can start singing a new song. So there's a challenge even with singing a new song, is to let go of the old and the past.
So in 1719, my research last night said, the Christmas carol, Joy to the World, was written, and it is based, truly was, based around Psalm 98.
Nice. I did not know that. That is great.
Nice.
That is amazing. Good info.
What I like about this psalm is verse 9, really verses 8 and 9, where it says, "Let the sea make a noise and all that is in it, the lands and those who dwell therein. Let the rivers clap their hands, and let the hills ring out with joy before the Lord when he comes to judge the earth." It's got, for me, a Tolkien-esque imagery here. J.R.R. Tolkien, Lord of the Rings, you know, where the trees come alive.
Right.
And,
Sure.
the hills, or the sound of music, right? The hills are alive with the sound of music.
Well
here,
done.
let the hills ring out with joy before the Lord.
Right.
I just love the creation imagery here, that when God has victory and when judgment comes, which normally we don't think of as a good thing, not only God's people, but the earth itself rejoices.
Right.
Which is a powerful, I mean, we could think about that today with the forces of pollution and destruction of forests and climate change. Like, when judgment comes and we start to crack down on some of the ways that we are not stewarding this world well, the world rejoices.
Right.
The earth rejoices because things are brought back into balance and wholeness. So I just love that about
So
this
we could
passage.
have one quick little prayer in our minds and hearts about the climate conference that is going on right now in Egypt on behalf of the entire world.
Yeah.
Right, exactly. And I think that's a good point to make, that when God renders judgment, it's not a reason to mourn, but particularly in this case, it's a reason to rejoice, right? There's cause to rejoice. And the last part of this psalm talks about when he comes to judge the earth, in righteousness shall he judge the world, not the lack of it.
Right.
In righteousness shall he judge the world. It's not our lack of a thing, but he's judging us in the righteousness that he attributes to us, not by virtue of anything we've done, but by virtue of who God is. And that's I think a good way of understanding God's judgment and justice, which is another way of understanding righteousness, is justice, is that God's judgment is not terminal, but it is correctional, right? And so many times we hear and think of God's judgment, and we had the image of fire, and we'll have that again in a minute, of fire and destruction. And yes, there is something about God's fire that is all-consuming, that is passionate. God's love is red hot for us. And so much so that God is not willing to let any of us go. Right? He loves us so much. And so when I read of God's judgment or justice or acts of justice and righteousness, it is in a sense of a way of correcting and bringing about the desired outcome and goal that God has for us.
And it says, we'll judge the world with righteousness and the peoples with equity. What a beautiful word equity is.
Oh,
Could
yeah.
God be inequitable? No.
Right.
There's
Come on.
the best equity we will ever receive
Yes.
will be from God.
Right. Absolutely. And then moving right along into our epistle lesson in 2 Thessalonians, here you have some very interesting conversation going on about work in the community and what does it mean? What is the work that is being discussed here? And what does it mean to be idle? And how are we to understand this? I think this is a text that has been misused and abused in a lot of ways by maybe well-meaning people. But I think if we understand it within the context that it is given, it's really giving us an idea of what community is supposed to look like. And we used to sing that song in elementary school, if we all work together, if we all work together, how happy we'll be.
Right.
And I think that's what I get when I read this, is this is what community looks like when we all work together.
Yeah. Again, I think context is important, and I'll say that again when we get to the gospel. But, you know, we're talking about the early church, and think about how the early church was often described. It was a community of people that shared everything that they had with one another. And so it was not this sort of, you know, sort of individualism that we have today. So it was not about, well, I work, and so I have my food, and I'm not going to give any of my stuff to you. You got to work to have your food. It wasn't about that. It was about a community of people that were sharing their resources. But then there were those within that community of sharing that were abusing that privilege. And they weren't participating. You know, they were receiving more than they were giving. But a community of love is one where you give and receive together. Like everyone is giving just as much as they're receiving,
as you're able, as you like to say.
Able, yeah, as you. So what Paul is charging with the 2 Thessalonians here is that some folks in the community have started receiving and taking more than they are giving. And this really has nothing to do with sort of an individualistic, you know, you work and you eat on your own, I work and I eat on my own. But it's, again, just like you're saying, if we work together, it's about contributing to society. Yeah. Right.
Yes, it would be very anachronistic to read this in light of American culture, particularly our sense of independence. We have the Declaration of Independence, which has so informed how we live our life, and the notion of pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. I mean, I grew up in a very hardworking Southern family who used this text, if you don't work, you don't eat, you know, as a means of proving a point. And that certainly is abusing what is being talked about here, but that's been the case in a lot of ways. People have used that to say you need to pull yourself up from your own bootstraps. And, you know, it's this whole Protestant ethic kind of thing that Max Weber talked about in his philosophy. And that's not what is going on in the early church.
Yeah, we belong to a culture that is addicted to work.
Yeah.
And addicted to being busy.
Yes.
And I don't think this is a criticism against, you know, everything in our society. It's not a criticism necessarily of capitalism or about working and getting, you know, working for a living and all of that. But I think this passage is challenging for us because in a society that's addicted to work, when you tell people not to be idle, they hear that one way. But there is a difference between idleness and rest.
Yeah.
And idleness is about, you know, about not contributing to society.
It's about lazy.
It's about being lazy.
Being lazy.
But rest is really important, and that's a message we also need to hear.
True.
So
Very
don't
much.
listen to this passage and hear, don't rest, only work.
Right.
That's not what this
That's not
passage
what it's
is saying.
No.
Did you have anything else to share?
Just one thought. You've been talking about generosity, Father Derek, in the last 4 weeks, I guess. And that has rung beautifully with many of us. I've heard so many comments, so thank you for all of that. There is nothing good to be said about living off the generosity of others. And if you're idle and lazy and know that somehow the rest of the community is going to make it all happen, well, number one, you're wrong, and number one, you are not being generous. You're withholding yourself and everything that you could give to be generous to the community that you describe.
Right. We all have something to contribute in some way or another. My great-grandmother raised my mom, and I know we're probably going long, and we probably don't need this story, but I'm going to share it anyway. She grew up in South Georgia on a farm, and she was not a very wealthy woman, but they raised cotton and corn and, you know, the normal farm stuff. And for every 10 acres of cotton that she raised, 1 acre went to the church. She didn't give them money, but she gave them what she had. If she had 10 chickens, 1 went to the church, you know. I mean, that's how she gave into that community and supported. And I think the reality is we all have something to contribute in some way or another. So don't look down on what you do not have. Value what you do have that you can contribute, and don't compare yourself to others, right? Because you can always find people that are either better than you or that you are better than. Just do what you believe in your heart is right for you to do in the community you're a part of. And moving right along, we'll go to the gospel. Gospel of Luke. And here we go with this very kind of I don't know. It is eschatological. Is it apocalyptic as well?
I don't know. It's a heavy passage.
It is a heavy
passage. That's the word that I would use to describe it. And again, I think the context is really important. So here in the Gospel of Luke, we have the disciples walking by the temple, and they're commenting on how beautiful it is. And Jesus says, well, you know, it's not going to be like that forever. Not one stone will be left on another, which was just mind-blowing for the disciples.
Right.
And they're like, teacher, when is this going to happen? How is that going to be? And then Jesus goes and starts talking, not really answering their question, instead talking about wars and insurrections and earthquakes and famines and plagues and dreadful portents and great signs from heaven. And then to make it go even further, that he talks about people being arrested and persecuted and even killed. And then finally, to make it just even more worse, you know, even parents and brothers and relatives and friends will turn against one another, and some of you will be put to death. So it's a heavy passage. I don't know what I'm going to say on Sunday for preaching about this.
Sounds like stuff we went through in the last few years.
I know, right? But I think the context is important. So Luke is writing this about Jesus after the destruction of the temple, after the destruction of Jerusalem. And so the folks that are reading this passage are reading it in the context of people were arrested, people were persecuted, the temple was torn down, and so they're not reading this as in, when is this stuff going to happen? They're reading it as in, oh my goodness, that happened. We're going through it right now. And so this is meant to be a passage that encourages and inspires Christians in the midst of adversity to keep on keeping on, to be persistent, and to use all of these turbulent times as an opportunity for testimony, for witnessing to the power of God and the presence of God in the midst of it. And so we here in the United States, we might see attempted insurrections every once in a while. We might see racial injustice. We might see natural catastrophes, especially with the rise of climate change. But overall, we don't have this experience of persecution as Christians the way others do. But, you know, we have our siblings in Haiti, for example, that are going through a turbulent time in the church there. There are folks that are in prison in the Episcopal Church in Haiti right now because of the work that they were doing. You think about Ukraine and all that's happening there. You think about so many places in the world, this is a reality for them as well. And so it can be hard for us to hear in our context, but it's important to recognize the context that it comes from and the context that people are living in and experiencing around the world right now. And this is a message of of inspiration and encouragement
Right.
to persevere.
Right.
You mentioned witnessing, discipleship. He said this coming before people you're going to be accused by. This will give you an opportunity to testify.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
I will give you words and wisdom to do that.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're not alone. Don't be timid. If this happens to you, it is part of the plan, and I will give you your tools.
Right.
I will give you your tools. That's good.
That's good. Also, one stone not being left upon another, the total dismantling of a system that has been around for thousands of years, that people have trusted in and depended upon, and it's gone. What do you do when everything you've trusted in is not there anymore? Who do you listen to? I mean, the next thing he says is there's going to be people coming, beware you're not deceived. Who are you listening to, right? And I think that is the challenge, is change comes, and how do we adjust and adapt to the change as we are led by the Spirit of God in the midst of that change? Mm-hmm. It's not easy. Change is never easy, but it's necessary, right? And it's challenging as well. And I think that it matters who we listen to, because it's either going to encourage us, or it's either going to push us forward, or it's going to pull us backward. God's voice, at least for me, always pulls us upward and forward, never downward and backward, right? And I think that that's something that I take from this text whenever I read it, at least for our current day and age. How do we apply this to what we're going through? I think when things begin to fall apart and become dismantled, systems fail, where's your trust and where's your hope being placed?
That's good.
And by your endurance, in verse 19, by your endurance you will gain your souls. Even if you die, your soul will live forever. If that's not eschatological,
Right,
I don't know what
It is.
is.
It is, absolutely.
Yeah.
All right. I think that is all that we have time for today.
Yeah.
Thank you for being with us. And if you enjoyed this podcast, be sure to subscribe so that you will never miss an episode. And be sure to share with your friends. You can also rate the show and leave us a review to help others find us. We thank you for joining us for this great discussion. We hope that you feel better prepared for worship this coming Sunday as we hear these words. Until next time, bye-bye.